Members, Erica Stanford. Erica's the daughter of a Dutch immigrant who she is very proud of Dad. Dad at 75 is still playing hockey on the North Shore. He was a Dutch immigrant. Erica holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in politics from the University of Auckland and cites a lecturer, Raymond Miller, as the reason for her passion in politics. She's married to Kane and has 2 children. Her position with the National Party has 2 responsibilities out of the 98 or so down there in Wellington: immigration and education. Both portfolios of education and immigration are absolutely critical to the success of any country, and certainly for that of New Zealand. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to welcome Erica. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. Can I just acknowledge your President, Mirko, thank you so much for inviting me along today, and also your work and community patrol as well. It is I don't get out as much as I'd like to, but it is certainly a way to get to know your community. Sometimes the darker side of your community. You know, you never knew that there was a drug house on that street and a drug house on that street and a gang house over there. It certainly opens your eyes to some of the things you didn't know were going on in the community. As I say, what I'm going to do is set an alarm, because as a politician what we tend to do is talk for far too long and then don't leave enough time for questions. So I'll do that now. Just before I start, can I just also give a plug for your conference? Because I recently went down to meet with Sir Peter, and he is an absolutely incredible man. I've met him a couple of times, and if you are going for nothing else, Sir Peter is just absolutely one of the most inspiring people I've ever met. And I went down in my capacity as education spokesperson to look at some of the work that he does around a history program that he's put together, and I don't know if he's going to talk to you about it at your conference, but he has done an amazing history curriculum about the travels of the Pacifica people to New Zealand, and he calls it the greatest navigational feat of mankind. And it is so incredibly inspirational and uplifting about the incredible engineering feats and the math and the science and that went into these people navigating over 4,000 kilometres across the Pacific. And when you are trying to inspire young Māori and Pacifica kids in class and tell them that they have STEM in them, that they were the greatest travellers of, in human history, and he actually says that he thinks it's a greater feat than going to the moon. It's so incredible and amazing and inspirational, and the Māori and Pacifica kids that do this program are just so inspired by it. So that alone is worth. I'm sure there'll be many other things that are worth going for, but he is just such a wonderful man. I thought I'd give you a bit of an update, if you like, and a bit of where we're going with the immigration portfolio. I do have education as well. We perhaps don't have time today to do everything, but if you want to ask questions about education, I'm happy to go there as well. Just a quick bit of background about me. As you heard, I've been the MP for East Coast Bays since 2017. I took over from Murray McCulley. He was the MP for 30 years, so to give you some perspective, he was elected a day after my 9th birthday, and then I worked for him for a few years, and then when he retired, put my name in the hat, and here we are. So I was born and raised in the East Coast Bays. I would never leave. I love the place. I love Auckland. I love New Zealand. And I'm really proud to represent the East Coast Bays, which stretches from Browns Bay down to, Long Bay actually, right down to Murray's Bay and out to Albany. So last year under Judith Collins, I specifically asked her in a meeting if I could have the portfolio for immigration, because I could see very clearly the issues that we had at the time, a year ago, that have been plaguing us, and I knew how important it would be in the future, clawing our way out of the economic carnage that has been wreaked on the country through COVID. And she let me have immigration, and here we are. So I guess the issue for me, and the reason I took it on, not only because I was a daughter of a migrant and have grown up with those stories, but when you take a look at New Zealand at our makeup, and we were just chatting about it earlier, we have an ageing population. and a declining birth rate, similar to other countries around the world who are grappling with the same problems. But just to give you some context, by 2040 there will be 10 people leaving the workforce to retire for every 5 entering. So we're going to be in a bit of strife. And when you layer on top of that what's happening at the moment with the brain drain, which has just started, when you see all these young people who've been trapped in New Zealand for a couple of years and are now looking to do their thing and, their rite of passage, leave the country and go and get some work experience. You layer on top of that the fact that we've had a lot of migrants in New Zealand leave because they, when the pandemic hit, they took off, but also over the last couple of years, and I'll go into why, but we have had tens of thousands of migrants leave the country as well. And on top of that, you are looking at people who are just looking for better opportunities overseas. We do have a cost of living crisis that is made worse by a few domestic factors. Let's face it, we have a gun shooting in Auckland every night, ram raids every day. It's very, very difficult to buy your first home. And so I think there will be some people who are starting to look at Australia and other countries. So put all those things together, we're in a bit of a tight spot when it comes to labour. And Adrian Orr said when he hiked the official cash rate for the second time in a row, by the way, that's the first time that's happened in New Zealand history, 50 basis points back to back. We're in for a bumpy ride. But he said when he did that the biggest constraint on our economic activity right now is our access to labour. That's the single biggest thing, the single biggest handbrake on our ability to grow and grow our way out of the cost of living crisis is our access to labour. And all of those things I talked about are adding in the mix to that problem. But one of the ways that we can get out of this is by having access to labour, having our borders open, getting skilled migrant workers in the country. And we haven't been able to do that for the last 2 years. We've had a very closed borders. It's been very, very difficult to get workers in the country unless you are working on a time-critical project for the government and you are uniquely skilled. It was a very high bar to get in the country. Of course, that's unless you were the Wiggles or an entertainer or a nanny. But for the most part, it was very, very difficult to get in the country. And here we are now, without opening up to the world, and we still can't get workers in the country, and we won't be until later this year. So we're in a very, very difficult position, and I guess that the question is, well, how did we get here and what's going on, and why is it that we aren't able to attract workers, and why aren't we open to workers at the moment? And it goes back, you've got to go back in history a little bit to the last few years. Pre-COVID, we had our immigration system, and you may have seen in the news, excuse me, someone's ringing, turn that down. You may have seen in the news over the last few years about the state of the immigration system and the fact we have this broken immigration system, and that was caused very much by the fact that we invited record levels of migrants into the country up until 2020. In fact, to March 2020, we had the highest net gain of migrants as far back as I can see, and I've looked back about 30 years, so that we had a net gain of 84,000. So record numbers of people coming in the country, but at the same time reducing the number of residence places they can get. So you can see what would happen. We end up with a huge backlog, a massive backlog of migrants who've come to the country looking for a better life for their family, wanting a pathway to residence, and then ending up in what basically happened was massively long queues that stretched out for years. And so that's kind of the backdrop of what happened pre-COVID. Huge long queues with migrants who were getting very frustrated about their investment in this country and the work that they'd done and the promise that they'd come here on, getting residence within a certain time frame, and that not happening. And that's when you started to see doctors leaving, nurses leaving, teachers leaving, engineers leaving. We were starting to get a big brain drain of talent overseas. And that has just been exacerbated through COVID. We basically slammed the borders shut in March and stopped processing any residents. So that's the background to where we're at, and that already has started to cause us this terrible reputation overseas where migrants were starting not to choose New Zealand as a destination because they could see there was no certainty about their pathway here. They could see migrants stuck in these long queues. And then, of course, COVID hit. and things got a lot worse for migrants who are here. And you would have heard the stories about the split migrant families, which I worked with a few journalists on to highlight these stories. And if you just take a moment to think about some of the people who are here in New Zealand, who the reason that they're split is quite often, and it's very normal for this to happen, in fact this is the norm, you'll get one person come to New Zealand to get that job, set up the house, open all the bank accounts, set up the life, while meanwhile their partner offshore sells the house, packs up the goods, gets the kids out of school, and then comes and follows. And so quite often what you saw across the pandemic was that all of these people who had come in sort of October, November, December 19, January, February, were setting up, and then the borders slammed shut, and they were trapped on two sides of the world. And you still have today people in New Zealand who have not seen their families for coming up 3 years. So this is women, and we fought for the nurses who we did get reunited, but for 2 years those nurses in New Zealand, those migrant nurses who'd come from predominantly India and the Philippines, who were working in our hospitals, working long hours, you know, overnight shifts, and you know how short-staffed we are, looking after us and working in aged care, looking after our parents in aged care. Meanwhile, their very young children were on the other side of the world, and they didn't get to see each other. And that goes for every profession. There were teachers, engineers, I mean, everyone. There were a lot of people trapped, and we did nothing about it. And it's a heartbreaking tragedy. We worked really hard to reunite the nurses. We made a really good case for them. And then we managed to reunite the teachers, and that's as far as we got. So as it stands today, if you are from a non-visa waiver country, where a lot of our migrants come from, they're still not reunited. And it was looking like October when the borders were going to open for their families to come. So that would have been bang on almost 3 years that you know that you hadn't seen your kids for a lot of these people. I tell you what, marriages are breaking down. Children overseas have got mental health problems from the separation. It is, you know, in my view, a stain on New Zealand for what's happened over the last few years. But the reason I'm telling you this is because it's fed into this terrible reputation we have overseas. Migrants who were stuck here, who couldn't leave without fear of not being able to get back during the pandemic, the split families, the long queues, the lack of certainty. Now, for a country with an ageing population, a declining birth rate, and the fact that we do rely very heavily on migrant workers, skilled migrant workers, it's not a good position to be in that your international reputation is completely in tatters, but that's where we are right now. And it's not getting any better, unfortunately. You've heard just recently about the immigration reset, where the government have tried to sort of patch things together, but unfortunately what they've done is taken their policy from 2018, which is how can we drive down migration, into today, forgetting that we've had a global pandemic. The worldwide situation right now is that there is a war on talent. So every country in the world trying to grow their way out of COVID is after the same talent. So it's a very different position than we were in 2018, or 2017, where people wanted to come to New Zealand and we had the pick. We've never really been like the top destination. If you think that, you know, we are, you know, Australia pays more, better conditions, easier pathways. So we've never really been the top destination, but we've certainly been in the top 3 as a place to come for migrant workers. We're not even on their radar anymore. We've completely dropped off their radar. And that's a shame, because we desperately need access to this talent. And at the same time, you've got Australia and Canada and the UK and America who are out there aggressively targeting migrants, good skilled migrants, to their countries. You take Australia, for example. If you're a skilled professional like a nurse, you can get residence as soon as you step foot in the country. In fact, before you even step foot in the country, they will hand you a residence ticket and say, please come. Working holiday makers, they're saying to them, if you come in before a certain date, you can have all your fees back. You know, you can be a bit older if you want to come in. If you're a working holiday maker, you can have a second go. You can come back and have another go when you're only supposed to really do one working holiday trip. So they're aggressively targeting to them. The same with international students. Australia last year in December opened their borders to international students. And here, New Zealanders, in this global context where everyone's fighting for the same talent, we've got an international reputation that's in tatters, and we are doing nothing to attract migrants. We are in fact doing the opposite. In fact, what you saw the other day from the immigration reset that was buried in the background were all of these roadblocks to getting migrants. We used to give the partner of a highly skilled migrant just an open work visa. So if you, for example, got a very highly trained software developer from somewhere and his wife was coming with him, she would have a visa to work in New Zealand. That's stopped now. She does not have that anymore. She now has to get a visa on her own right. And if she's coming from a country, say like India, and English isn't her strong suit, getting a visa in her own right and having now to earn the median wage, which is $28 an hour, is going to be really, really tough. And so we're not going to be attracting that talent. Students this year, we put a cap, 5,000 on. Why we did that, no one has been able to explain it to me. It was our 4th biggest export earner, the international student market. We capped it this year of 5,000 students. So completely at a loss to understand why that is. I've got my local high schools sitting there with students waiting to come into this country, and they got allocated 2 each, or 3 maybe. The universities are waiting to bring in students. Auckland University filled their quota immediately. So here we are trying to claw our way out and grow our way out of this, and the handbrakes are on at every single stage. Even with the green list that you might have seen that was announced, where we are going to be giving residence to some, I think it's about 75 occupations on that list, immediate residence, but there were doctors on that list, engineers, a few scientists. But even then, they still managed to put roadblocks in the way. There's a second list, and you may have seen in the news, that's got midwives, nurses, teachers on it, and they have to wait 2 years for residence. Now, when you look at what Australia, Canada, and the US are doing with nurses, let's just take nurses. It's a great example, because you've all seen in the last few days the queues in the hospitals and the workforce crisis that's going on there. Those 3 countries are giving immediate residence to any nurse they can get their hands on. And here we are in New Zealand with 4,000 nurses short. It was 1,100 alone in the aged care facility. We've got aged care facilities closing down around the country because they can't get nurses. Here we are saying, oh, actually, no, we're going to make you wait 2 years for residence. Now, if you were a nurse, a qualified nurse with great experience overseas, and you were thinking about emigrating and you wanted to look at your options, would you go to Australia, Canada, or the States who pay more, better conditions, and you can get residence the day you step foot in the country, or you can come to New Zealand where you've heard that there are long queues for residence. They've treated migrants really badly over the last few years where we separated families. And by the way, it's going to take you 2 years to get residence, or to apply for residence, I should say, 2 years, and then goodness knows how long to actually have that processed. We're not competing. We're not competing at all. And if the government thinks we are, they're absolutely dreaming. So we've got some real challenges in the immigration space. The world has changed. We have to be far more open, far more nimble, far more accepting, and we have to be at very least, on level pegging with Australia when it comes to those critical workforce that we need. The reason that this is so important, is because if you were to go into any hospital right now, it's like the United Nations. The doctors that treat you, the nurses that treat you from all around the world. The teachers at my daughter's high school, and a parent-teacher interview the other night, I don't think any of them were born here. All the STEM teachers especially, we're desperately short of STEM teachers. I hold the education portfolio as well, and there is a lot of work to be done on the supply side. Of course, we want to train up and retain as many Kiwis as we can. But the part of the puzzle that I'm looking at is how do we backfill that gap now with migrant workers? And right now, we are not able to compete. What's really frustrating to me is that while the rest of the world are open right now, their borders are open to bring in workers, you might think we're bringing in workers, but we're not. We're not bringing in workers at all. The work visa, the main work visa category, it's got a fabulous acronym, the AEWV, that cannot even be applied for until the 4th of July. It's not open, it's closed. It's not open until the 4th of July, and that's when you can apply, and goodness knows how long it will take to actually process, and then you get in the country. I don't think we'll see any of those workers in the country until at least September. And I'll finish off by saying the thing that I'm most disappointed in is that even though that'll be open from the 4th of July, I think finally we can get workers in the country, unless you're on that green list, so that's 75 occupations, there's no other pathway to residence right now that's currently open. The government have closed them all pending a review. So again, I go back to the question, if you were a skilled migrant, highly trained dairy farmer, or even a truck driver, which by the way we're desperately short of. But if you were any job that not on that green list, so scientist, doctor, engineer, mostly it's construction and construction, science and medicine. If you're not on that list, why would you come to New Zealand if there's no pathway to residence? Why would you sell your house, uproot your family, take your kids out of school, and move halfway across the world for an unknown? You wouldn't do it. So my prediction is that even though in July we have the borders open for these work visas, people on work visas to come in the country, we won't see many. And I'll give you an example, I'll finish on this, is why you won't see it, why I'm unfortunately will be proved right. Back in January this year, the Immigration Minister got up in front of Business New Zealand and said, for the last 2 years we haven't let anyone in the country. We've let some critical workers in, but the bar's been very high, like I said at the beginning. He said we're going to ease those conditions. So instead of being uniquely skilled on a government project, time critical, we're just going to make it, all you have to do is earn 1.5 times the median wage. That's it. As long as it's job tested, 1.5 times the median wage. And he said this is going to bring in 20,000 workers over the next few months until the new visa categories open on the 4th of July. That was in January. 20,000 workers we're going to bring in the country. And I said to him at the time in the House, this is all very well and good and it sounds good from the outside, but you have to understand human nature. Is there a pathway to residence for these people? These are highly skilled people, 1.5 times the median wage. And the answer was, there is no pathway to residence. It's still closed, pending the review, and there wasn't even a green list back then. So to the end of March, out of the 20,000 workers that he promised we would get into the country, 6 arrived. Not 6,000, 6. And through to the end of April, he won't release the figures, but we know they've granted 400 visas. They haven't. I don't know how many have arrived, but even if every single one of those granted had arrived in the country, we're still only up to 406 out of 20,000. That proves my point that you have to have a pathway to residence. People need to, even if they think, oh, maybe if I might need to be in New Zealand for a couple of years to get there, to work my way up to getting, they just want to know what the pathway is and how they reach it and what their steps are. Because we will not be able to attract the best talent if we are not the best ourselves. We will attract, frankly, the desperate. And that's not what we want in this country. We want to be able to attract the best talent. And right now we're losing out the best talent to Australia, to Canada, to the UK, to America, because frankly, terrible reputation, no pathway to residence, our borders aren't open. It's a complete and utter mess, a nightmare. And that matters for us. Why that matters is we're not going to be able to grow. As Adrian all said, as I said back at the beginning, the single biggest handbrake on our economy is that access to labour. It's every business I go to, every single business. The biggest thing that they're confronted with is labour shortages. Doesn't matter what sector, what region, what skill level, every single business talks about that. So it matters for our kids who go to school every day and the teachers that teach them. It matters if you go to the hospital and you need treatment by a nurse or a doctor. It matters if you want your goods to be delivered and there are no truck drivers. It matters for our primary industries because they're desperately short of dairy workers. It matters for our horticultural industry who are letting fruit rot on the ground because they can't get it picked. It matters right across the country, and unfortunately we've had a couple of decades of dog whistle politics from old mate Winston Peters, and there is people wherever I go say, we don't need migrant workers. Unfortunately, the reality is we absolutely do. Not only are they wonderful for our society and our culture, but actually they are driving our economy. And you look at the cost of living crisis right now, and the economic outlook. If you see the ANZ Business Confidence Survey, I think it was out yesterday, it's not good. And so our ability to access migrant labour is vitally important, and I don't have any confidence that we'll actually see many workers in the country this year. So I'll finish there just by saying, we are fighting really hard to try and get things. We managed to get the borders moved from October up to July, being fully opened, which was a great win. But the settings still aren't there, so we're fighting really hard for that. So on that, I've got about 10 minutes to take some questions. Yes?
I'm the CEO in Aged Care, and our sector's been doing one hell of a lot to get the government to listen. And and the thing that astonishes me is that there's never any grasp of the pathway, as you said. So the pathway to getting registered nurses in the country can't bring in overseas trained nurses, they work in aged care, we get them through the CAP course,
Yes.
they then achieve New Zealand registration, they work another couple of years and they go on to acute services when they've got some confidence. We've currently got offers out to 4 highly trained registered nurses, overseas trained, who've been working in places like Dubai, Saudi, all around the world, and it takes months and months for them to achieve a visa. And this is what we're up against. Why is it, I mean, I know that Immigration New Zealand lost a lot of staff during COVID, but what are the other factors? What's driving that grave inefficiency?
A couple of things. You're right. During the global pandemic, and just before, a lot of offshore offices were closed. So our big offices in Beijing, and we had a couple in through India as well. They were all closed, and the idea was to bring everything back to New Zealand. Unfortunately, what happened was they closed those offices and then didn't increase the capacity in New Zealand. And so I think I'm just musing, but I think what happened was they thought, oh, it's a global pandemic, we don't need to worry about hiring new staff, no need to worry. And on the back of that, and many of you may have heard of the Resident 2021 visa that was introduced last year, so that was a way, basically, all of those backlogs I talked about in residence, it was so bad, and we were losing all of these amazing people overseas because I just frankly had enough. The minister introduced this visa, and it was basically to give 110,000 people, or applicants, the right to get their residence, and it was going to be a very quick one-off to keep everyone in the country. Unfortunately, he massively underestimated the capacity of Immigration New Zealand to do that work. So he said last year in December, we will have 80% processed in a year, so December this year. They're currently on track for January 2024. So that's how far behind they are. Instead of, and this is what frustrates me, instead of increasing the capacity at Immigration New Zealand to do that job, which is going to be massive, we've never given residence to 106, well, it's going to be 230,000 people by the time we're finished. It's gone well over, it's a whole other story. But instead of increasing the capacity to do that, he just took every resource in Immigration New Zealand that existed in New Zealand and put them all onto R21. So when the Prime Minister came along in December and said, we're going to be opening the borders in January, Chris Farfoy must have had a small panic attack and said to her, we can't do that because I can't process visas. And so that's why we saw a very, very long, protracted rollout this year of the border reopening. It was nothing to do with health. It was, and the Prime Minister has admitted that it was all to do with Immigration New Zealand capacity. So the reason for the long rollout, the reason for the fact that it takes 5 months right now to process a work visa, 3 months for a 5 months for a visitor visa. Just to give you some context, when we left office, it was 21 days to process a visitor visa. It's now 5 months. And that is the same for every single visa processing category. So that's the reason you've got, they didn't expand the workforce when they closed the offshore offices. They're all stuck on the Resident 2021 visa. They haven't increased the workforce to compensate for that, which is why long period of rolling open the border and the fact that we can't get a nurse in the country tomorrow, we have to wait months to process the visa. And that, the whole purpose of Resident 2021 was to, I say, burn the house down and start again, rebuild, get rid of the backlogs. Instead, it has just created a whole lot more backlogs. So we're exactly back to where we started. We're not nimble and able to quickly get staff in the country at a time when I know in aged care how desperate you are.
I mean, we've got a Swedish registered nurse who's worked as senior nurse, and she's still grovelling to get residency. I mean, it's insulting the way we treat them.
Well, the whole 2021 resident visa did give a lot of nurses the ability to get residence fast-tracked, but as I say, they've already been waiting for 2 or 3, 4 years, and now it was supposed to be a year, but it's looking like 2 and a bit years. So it's just, you have to remember, if you don't have residence, you can't buy a house, you can't have access to KiwiSaver. There's a whole lot of things you can't do in this country. So if you're again, if I go back to, if you're a highly skilled migrant offshore, you're going to go to Australia, we can buy a house and have your pension paid into and have all the rights of a citizen, or are you going to come here and be stuck on a huge long wait list If your child gets to the age of tertiary education, you can't pay for it because you're not eligible for domestic fees. They can't get a student loan. You can't buy a house. You're stuck in a rental. How attractive is that to the very best of the best? It's not attractive at all. Yes.
Erica, it seems to me that every government department is asleep at the wheel. What is National going to do in your portfolio to immigration around?
Yeah, that's a good question. And my view is that it comes from the top. Leadership comes from the top. I don't believe that, especially in immigration, that we've had a minister who is in charge of his portfolio across the detail and driving performance in Immigration New Zealand. And I can see what's happened. And I've heard the stories you may have heard as well, that Chris Farfoy did not want to stand at the last election, but he was talked into it by Chris Hipkins. And I don't think he wants to be there. He's not particularly interested. I know he's not across the detail. He says things that are wrong all the time. He's not across immigration detail. And he has been captured by his officials who are driving what's happening. And I have talked to people in Immigration New Zealand who say that the workplace culture is toxic. There's a revolving door of staff. It's going to take a lot to turn that around, more than just a governance role. It's going to take a minister who is actually down there on the shop floor, making sure that the CE is actually doing his or her job and driving performance. And they've got performance manuals of how they are supposed to be processing things in a timely fashion. But the culture there of, oh well, I'm a bit afraid of COVID, so I might stay home when everyone else is back to work. But everything's paper-based, so I can't do any work at home. So there's a lot of problems. But I tell you what, leadership comes from the top. Someone who's on top of their job and driving the CE and driving performance at those departments, and it just hasn't been happening. And they run rings around him. Yes.
Would it be too hard just to open the doors for a month and then close them?
It would be now, it really would be, because there's just the new employer accredited work visa that's open in July was supposed to be open a year ago, and it got delayed 6 months. I mean, Ian Lees Galloway worked on it. That's how long ago they started work on it. It's been delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed because no one is pushing the bureaucrats to move at pace. We needed to be ready. We had 2 years to get ready to have our borders open. And we just weren't in a position to do it. It is unforgivable that there is no work visa available until July. And they don't have the ability to bring that forward because they're still working on it. So it would be nice. It beggars belief. Every other country in the world is open, and here we are without a work visa pathway until July. And you know how long it takes to get a nurse in the country. You can imagine. You apply for it in July, realistically, at best, September they might arrive, but probably later. Yes. Right.
Isn't it totally against government policy to bring workers in at all? We've got a crisis here with 25,000 people waiting for a home. The government really is protecting its own back by not allowing workers into the country and sacrificing the economy.
Well, so the question was about, isn't it government policy not to bring migrant workers in because we've got people on a wait list? And also, I'd argue we've got 50,000 extra people on a job seeker benefit right now. And if we can't get those people into work now, when will we ever do that? So there are other things going on. But I guess the point is that you have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to be able to invest in infrastructure and invest in housing at the same time having access to skilled labour. And look, no one's talking about opening up the floodgates and allowing what happened just before 2020, where we had a flood of migrant workers. I mean, we have to be very, so when I talk about immigration, we need to be very targeted, which regions, which sectors, which skill levels. I'm not, certainly not want to go down the pathway where this government are being very elitist. We only want the top. Actually, we need truck drivers. And we're not producing our own. We're paying horrendous amounts to be a truck driver. We still can't attract people. We can't let the economy falter because we can't get enough people to drive trucks. We've got to be able to do both of those things. And the good thing about the immigration system is that we have levers to pull so that we can control the flow of migrants to match our ability to house them. But actually, I'm not overly worried about that, because when I look at the projected loss of Kiwis and migrants over the next 12 months, we're going to be back standing in the Cape Town going, this many people left New Zealand this week. That's where we are going to be. we need to be able to replace that at the very least, but also add to our labour workforce as well. But in a very careful and planned way, where we're working with regional, with councils, with chambers of commerce, with sector leads, because they know how many people they need and we know where we need them. So we just need to be a little bit smarter about how we're bringing people in and where we're bringing them into.